There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We are here today with Dan Shure. He is the co-owner of Evolving SEO, and he's also the host of the really popular podcast, Experts on the Wire. Dan, how you doing today, man?
I'm excellent. Thanks for having me.
I am really stoked to have you, Dan. I've heard your name a ton. I've seen you on Twitter. I've heard a lot of people say a lot of really great things about you. So really excited to have you here. Before we get into our topic, we're going to be talking about an 80-20 SEO growth strategy for B2B blogs. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about Evolving SEO, and then also tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Absolutely. So essentially, I'm an SEO consultant. I help companies large and small, for example, WGBH being a current client, but down to companies that are maybe a small blog or a small e-commerce site, essentially help lead them through their SEO challenges and strategy through education, training, research, strategy, competitive research, and help them grow their traffic or avoid issues like algorithm updates, such as the one that just happened a week ago. It was a really big one, by the way. And then the Experts in the Wire, my SEO podcast, we've been on the air about 2.5 years. I interview SEO and marketing experts like Rand Fishkin, Noah Kagan, Pamela Wilson of Copyblogger, Brian Dean of Backlinko, even John Mueller from Google. And that's a lot of fun. And what I really try to do with those guests is dig into the details, to the stuff that you don't hear them talk about elsewhere. And I think the audience really, really likes that.
I love it. So Dan, I want to dive into this 80-20 SEO growth strategy. You've broken it down, as we were talking about it offline. You've broken it down into basically a 4-part process. Before we dive into step one, just give us a little bit of an overview of the 80-20 SEO growth strategy, and then we'll dive into step one.
Absolutely. And it's a little bit of a philosophy, which I'll touch upon here. So if anyone out there listening is not familiar with 80-20, I definitely recommend getting the book 80-20 Principle and just getting familiar with the concept of that. That being is that typically 20% of the input or activity results in 80% of the results. And so what that means is if you can tap into that and understand what are those 20% of inputs that are causing 80% of the outputs, well, you can just work on that 20%. So I see a lot of companies working really, really, really hard at the wrong things or at things that maybe aren't wrong, but they're not that 20% that's really going to show them growth. So I sort of stumbled into this principle in relation to blog content probably 3 or 4 years ago when I initially grew the traffic of a blog 20x for a particular SaaS client, B2B SaaS client. And so that's kind of the approach, right? It's just figuring out what you can do to grow traffic a little bit more easily.
I love it. So the first part of this 4-part process, Dan, you say that you've got to find your current top posts. Talk to us about what this looks like.
Yeah, what you have to do first is figure out what is your current 20%, whether you've been blogging for 5 years or 5 months. If you have 10 posts or 1,000 posts, you're going to have a handful of posts that are driving an outsized amount of your traffic. So it's quite simple. All you need to do is go to your analytics, maybe segment by search traffic, and look at your landing pages. And the landing pages that are getting the most traffic are probably there's probably 5 or 10 that are really, really big winners. Identify on average how much traffic a month are those top winning posts driving. And so if you identify that your top posts are getting maybe on average 1,000 visits a month, that's your 20% number, right? Like you want to add more content that's going to get 1,000 visits or more per article. And that's how you grow that top 20%. But that's your first step, is just identifying what articles are the top 20% currently.
Got it. So you identify, say a handful of posts that are bringing in, 1,000 visits a month or whatever the case is. I guess you then dive into, okay, they're all about this, topic, or they're all structured in a certain way. Like, what are you looking for inside of those posts so that you can ultimately, design other content to match that?
Usually the common thread for why they're getting the most traffic is simply because they target a topic that has high search volume that you rank for. Okay. And oftentimes with companies that have not invested a lot in SEO, or they don't do SEO in a very calculated way, that happens by happenstance, which is great. Like I talk to so many companies and they're like, oh my goodness, we have this one post, it's doing amazing. That's what they say, in air quotes. Yet they have no idea why it's done amazing. But when you dig in and you look, they happen to write about a topic that really nails a particular keyword that they ranked for. And so they're getting all their traffic with that sort of magic, recipe, so to speak. So that's the thread that's the formula of why they're getting traffic. Then from there, once you identify that, and in the next step, we'll talk about maybe aligning with topics, but that's kind of what's driving the traffic.
Got it. So before we get to that, you've got another step in this process that you've got to define your traffic goal. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think let's say you've got those handful of posts that are getting 1,000 visits a month, and then you want to look at your entire blog traffic, and let's say the entirety of the blog is getting 20,000 visits a month. If you want to double your traffic, then that's going to lead you to, well, how many posts do I need that each get 1,000 visits a month before I double traffic? And doing a simple, math formula here, it might be more complicated in reality, but if you add 20 posts that get 1,000 visits each, that's doubling your traffic, assuming they all rank and get the clicks, etc. Let's say you write 10 posts that get 2,000 visits a month. Well, that's only 10 posts that you need to double your traffic. So that's sort of how the math works, is you think of how much traffic is one piece of content going to receive. And the slight nuance here is so many people look at SEO as keyword search volume. And, they might look at a keyword like, for example, I have a video on YouTube that sort of breaks down the 80-20 process. And the example I use is a keyword called data planning cycle. And you might look at that keyword and say, oh, well, that keyword has 500 searches a month. Yet, a post around that topic will often rank for thousands of keywords when you throw in all the long tail and the synonyms and the variations, etc. So what you really end up with is a traffic potential versus just looking at the search volume of one keyword.
That's interesting. I think I've definitely fallen into that trap of, as we're kind of exploring topics to write about, of just looking at traffic. Is there a particular tool, or is there like, what has helped your clients see kind of the total potential traffic as opposed to just looking at, search volume?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this fits into, nice segue into the planning process. I like to use SEMrush. And the best way to figure out a traffic estimate is take a topic that you're interested in writing about. And we'll talk about a little keyword research in a moment. But let's say you do land on data planning cycle. You search that keyword in Google, and then pull out the top ranked article that's most centric to that topic. So let's say you see a data planning Wikipedia page rank. That's too broad. That's not going to be usable to get the data. You want to find the article that specifically talks about and ranks for a data planning cycle. So you don't want to pull something out that's too broad. Once you identify that, and in some cases there isn't an example, but in most cases there are. And once you ID that, bring that over to SEMrush and just drop it into the search bar. And that should return the URL report. that URL report is going to show their estimate for how much monthly traffic that article is getting.
Oh, wow.
And keep in mind that, make sure your settings are set to US and Google, et cetera. And then also, by default, you're going to see just desktop estimates. You can also click on mobile to get an estimate for mobile. Oftentimes, I just stick to desktop because, especially with B2B, it's very much a desktop world in many cases now. But typically, that number you see, let's say I drop a post in there and SEMrush shows something like 856 visits a month. You can usually safely round that up a little bit. You can, in some cases, almost even double that number, and that's the actual traffic number, because SEMrush only has like a sample set of data. And they're just using like a click-through rate curve, to estimate. But that's going to give you the number. And so once you identify topics and you're pulling out posts that already exist and putting them in SEMrush, that gives you the traffic potential. And then one last little icing on the cake. For all my clients, I do this in a 12-month time period. So I'll actually take the monthly number, multiply it by 12, and tell them in a 12-month time period, once you start ranking, here's your annual potential traffic. And I think that number is way more realistic and relevant to the true ROI of content, because we all know well and good, it's not just a month ROI. Once you post something and you start ranking for it, you're going to be there for usually a year, if not more.
Got it. And so once you identify those topics that are already ranking on the first page of Google, then it's just a matter of basically like picking apart that content and making the content that's currently like making a version of that content that's better, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of nuances. So certainly a higher quality piece of content is one approach to it. Oftentimes you'll find that, especially if you have the luxury of working on a site that has a high authority already, a high domain authority in terms of links, and even just a high topical or brand awareness authority, you can oftentimes create a piece of content that is maybe just different, but you'll potentially rank better because you have a higher authority. So that's always a leverage point or a ranking gap that I look for when identifying topics. I think it'd be worthwhile to back up one quick step to just a couple tips for how to identify these topics. Because oftentimes, especially as an outside consultant, when I'm stepping into a new company, for example, I was helping a company recently around the topic of liens. And it's like, I didn't even know what a lien was really until I talked to them. And then after that point, everything's an unknown to me. So one of the challenges is identifying these topics to start digging into to begin with. And there's two ways to do this that I recommend. One is the Moz Keyword Explorer, and then the other one is BuzzSumo's Question Analyzer. So what you do is you start with a known topic, let's say lien, and you drop that into the Moz Keyword Explorer, and then you play with the filters a little bit. One being set to based upon broadly related topics, another one based upon search results with similar pages. You basically play around with the filters a little bit, but what the tool does really, really well, it spits out related topics to you. So then you'd see like notice of commencement and like all of these other terms that you wouldn't even know to look for. And so that's a really amazing way to just kind of gather up all of these broad topics. And then similarly, if you drop a topic into BuzzSumo's Question Analyzer, what that tool does is it's scouring millions of Q&A websites for people that have asked questions around that topic. But what it does is it gives you a nice tab cloud at the top, or word cloud, that shows you all of the co-occurring terms that most appear when somebody has asked about a lien. And so that's another really great way to kind of get beyond these topics. Yeah, and the last thing I'll mention with that is don't be afraid to go top of funnel or mid funnel. One big way to make this strategy work for you is to know that you can go for these terms that might not directly relate and lead to a conversion, but it's going to attract a lot of traffic, a lot of awareness, a lot of that first touch point traffic, and it brings value in a different way. But oftentimes those top or mid funnel topics have a lot more opportunity to them.
Today's growth story is all about search engine marketing. The company we're highlighting is SentinelOne. This challenger cybersecurity brand was set out to disrupt the endpoint protection space. Their brand was top-notch, their product was innovative, but they were struggling to gain traction online in an already developed industry. Then they found Directive Consulting, a B2B search marketing agency. Within the first quarter of working with Directive, SentinelOne was able to increase their organic traffic by 128% and overall lead volume by an outstanding 251%. Now, I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview. Yeah, that makes sense. And so those two tools, just to reiterate those tools, you said Moz Keyword Explorer was one, and then the other one was BuzzSumo's Question Analyzer. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
Awesome. And I just actually saw Brian Dean's post about BuzzSumo, like the definitive guide to BuzzSumo, and it was an incredible piece of content that just kind of walked through a lot of different features inside of BuzzSumo that will make it worth your while. So I think if you just Google probably backlinko BuzzSumo, the article would pull up. But definitely check that out. So now, Dan, we've done the research. We've found, our current 20%, those top posts on our site that are driving the most traffic currently. We've established kind of what our traffic goal is moving forward based on a lot of what you just explained. Now we've started to determine what topics we are going to create content around to achieve that traffic goal. But now this fourth step of the process, we've actually got to execute and create this stuff. Talk to us about how we go about doing that.
Yeah, this is definitely as much art as it is science and as much practice, as it is theory. But some quick tips, right? I mean, the first step that I urge all my clients, writers that I work with, is just search Google. Start by searching Google for the topic you're going to cover. And you can learn a lot by looking at Google's search results, especially nowadays where they're really getting the mapping of user intent very well. Start by looking at what content's currently ranking, and literally take the time and click on everyone and really analyze, pick apart, maybe trying to figure out, like, what about this content is causing Google to rank it currently. So that's one thing you can do. Second is you can use a plugin like Keywords Everywhere, and it's a free plugin for Chrome. Once you install it, it's going to give you a lot of data in your search results. But one in particular is where they pull out all the related keywords from the page that Google would normally be suggesting to you, but they pull it all out in a box on the right-hand side. And this just gives you an insight to what are common questions, themes, details of this topic that users are looking for when they're searching the broad topic. And so that's really useful as well. And then finally, you also want to look at what content types is Google surfacing. Are they surfacing video, images, a map, e-commerce results, shopping results? Because often you're going to want to mix that into your content. So in other words, if they're surfacing YouTube videos, put a video in your content. If they're ranking images close to the top, especially of a chart or a graph, put that in your content. So it's really a matter of studying the search results to decipher what should that even look like to begin with. But then one thing I've been doing with my clients is taking it a step further and using this insight to develop a rough outline of the content and structure. Okay. One thing I find is, ranking for search is way more about the structure of the content versus, should I, stuff these keywords in my header and put them in bold letters and all these like tricks that a lot of people used to do, but really don't matter a whole lot anymore. I'll give you a funny example. At least a few months ago, if you were to search protein in eggs in Google, the top two post ranking were basically, here are 50 foods that have more protein than eggs. And so the content's not even about answering the question. It's about anticipating what is the user really looking for. Somebody interested in how much protein are there in eggs, that's probably somebody just trying to increase their protein. So Google's like, no, we got you. We're just going to give you all these other ways that have more protein than eggs. So it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, so protein in eggs wasn't even in the title or in the URL in an optimized way, yet those articles were ranking. So this is a nuance, and that's why I say it's art as much as science, is really trying to understand what the user wants by just studying search results. But getting back to the structure, I do recommend creating an outline, and you can use these different things like the related searches, autocomplete, studying the content that's already been created to figure out what is the structure of your content. And a little more specifically with that is oftentimes I'll see, getting back to the data planning example, oftentimes just somebody searching data planning, they're really looking for a definition or what is data planning or the overview. But a lot of people will mistakenly jump into how to use data planning or why you need it, or like these things that are more sort of in the weeds than what the user is looking for. And so I would just be mindful of, like, does the user want a list? Do they want a how-to? Do they want an opinion? Do they want a comparison? All these different like content formats. And you want to make sure to match the right one to your particular topic.
So once the topic's obviously been defined, the structure has been outlined. Any tips around, beyond that point, the actual creation of the content once the structure's been laid out?
Yeah, nowadays, and especially with this last Google update, I can't emphasize enough having an expert actually create or at least review the content. I want to point all the listeners to actually something that came out in 2011, but is so relevant to Google now. It's if you just Google 23 questions, Amit Signal, he was like the former head of search, I think, for Google. He put together a list of questions to ask yourself about your content. And one of them is, for example, is this website the primary source of this content? So in other words, like Google and users are looking for, they don't always want secondhand opinion or secondhand advice. They want like something from an expert, or they want something from the primary source, especially in some fields like finances, for example. And so when you're creating the content, I mean, that's the top thing that I see so many companies trying to take a shortcut on, is just hiring a freelance writer to do a little research. And like that can work sometimes, depending upon the competition of what's out there. But there's so much content generally out there now for all the different spaces and industries. You really, really should have an expert at least create the content, or like I said, have an oversight on the content. So if you're creating content for law or for, like I said, finances, have somebody in those fields at least review the content, and then on the content itself say, this has been reviewed by such and such name, doctor or lawyer or whatever it is, to show that credibility. And then make sure to link to the author's page with their credentials as well. That's something Google's definitely looking for.
Got it. I love it. So anything else on this last step, Dan, before we kind of do an overview and then close it down today?
There's a lot of directions that could go in. I think that I'll counter a myth that I hear out there a lot for the listeners.
Okay.
And the myth being, all content has to be super long and in depth. We mentioned Brian Dean. I mean, he's known for doing like 2,000, 3,000 word posts, etc. That's great for some searches, but again, it goes back to user intent. So that's not true. And I mean, people from Google have said that there's no absolute length of content, or like short content can do fine. And I've seen this working in reality. I literally had a client. It was for, I think the keyword was sales team names. All this post is a list of sales team names, like literally. And I had another client that was health coaching business names, and it was just a list of like 50 or 100 name ideas. That was it. There's like a paragraph of text and just a list of names, and that's it. I call this fast food content. Oftentimes, you want like a hamburger from McDonald's, right? You don't want an expensive steak, and so a lot of searchers, that's what they want. They want the quick answer to solve their problem. So in many cases, if you're giving somebody a long, in-depth post, that actually might not help them. They might just want the quick answer. So I think you need to be mindful of that. So I think that's something I see a lot of people make a mistake on.
And it's something I've bought into as well. Thinking like, every post has to be 2,000 words, and then it's 2,500 words. And it's like, dang, before I know it, every post I write is going to have to be 5,000 words. And I might as well just write a book about it. So that's really good to know, that length of content. I think I hear that a lot in B2B marketing circles, that that content needs to be extraordinarily long to be able to rank. So it's good to know that that's not always the case, but there's still a bit of critical thinking, I'm sure, that goes into understanding whether this is fast food content or not.
Exactly. Yep. And that's where the art of it comes in. And if you're not sure, what I say is put the quick and easy stuff at the top and then go in more depth in the bottom or underneath that.
All right. So to break this down, Dan, so the first step of this process is to find your current 20%. So going in, looking at your analytics, finding out what are the current posts that are driving the most traffic. Then you want to, transitioning into step 2, you want to figure out, okay, what is our traffic goal for content? And so if we can replicate, the traffic we're getting from these, 3 or 4 posts or whatever that number is, it's going to, get us to this number. We want to get to this number. So how many additional posts do we need to create to be able to get us there? And then you did a real deep dive on topics that can help you get there. You talked about Moz Keyword Explorer. You talked about BuzzSumo's Question Analyzer. You have a lot of resources around that. And then the 4th step is actually creating that content. So you mentioned a plugin called Keywords Everywhere. The article that you mentioned, I think, was 23 questions by, did you say Amit Signal?
Yeah.
And so check out those resources. Dan, if there's somebody listening, they want to stay connected with you, maybe they want to dive in and ask a deeper question about something that you shared, what's the best way for listeners to stay in contact with you?
Twitter is definitely where I'm most easy to kind of get a hold of. I tend to miss a lot of DMs, but if you at me, I'll usually see that. So that's at DAN_SHURE. And then definitely listen to the podcast, Experts in the Wire. If you're looking for in-depth, advanced SEO, medium to advanced SEO. I'd say those are the 2 best places. You can also check out the website of of&nbsp.com.
Love it. Awesome, Dan. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been fantastic, and I really appreciate it, man.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.